Hello, this is Arthur Busch. Thank you for joining us at Radio Free Flint. Today's podcast is about the Sharee Miller case. People versus Sharee Miller was a murder that happened in 2000 in Genesee County in Clow, Michigan. I have the trial attorney that tried that case to verdict, and I, of course, was the prosecutor in that case. We decided, in light of recent national publicity on 2020 and Dateline and other outlets, we decide to do our own panel discussion and fill you in on what we feel really happened in this case. So join us. This is the first true crime broadcast we've had in quite some time, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, this is Arthur Busch. You're listening to Radio Free Flint, and today I have a really good show for you. This is David Nickola, who is a super lawyer from Flint, Michigan. Welcome, David, to Radio Free Flint.
Welcome, Art. Thanks for having me.
And I must say, after all these years, we're actually not fighting.
Yes, that's correct. We're on the same team now.
Yet. Welcome, by the way.
We had a case, it was People versus Sharee Miller, and it obviously turned into a national media frenzy on Court TV and the Good Morning America. All these different networks were covering it because it was so salacious at the time, because there was videos sent back and forth from her to her friend that she had allegedly conspired with to kill her husband. So she started this affair, but this was the very beginning of chat rooms and the very beginning and the very essence of non-commercial use of the internet. And this was right in the heart of it. So there's a lot of new things happening, and it was the technical stuff. There weren't a lot of experts at that time that weren't teaching at schools or whatnot. And so it was really fresh, new, very salacious, naughty. People like that stuff. But it was serious too, because an individual was murdered, her husband, and it became she did it, that type of thing. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't, and there was a lot of evidence on each end that went both ways. And quite frankly, as this matter went along, in the conclusion of it, the jury was split between men and women, right down the middle, and the men were voting to acquit, and the women didn't like her.
So the case we're talking about is People versus Sharee Miller in Genesee County Circuit Court. It was tried in front of Judge Judith A. Fullerton, a circuit judge. I just happened to be the prosecuting attorney. David was the defense attorney, as things would turn out. I did not try the case. I put the case together as it was rolling along, and then assigned a team of lawyers to work on it. And we worked together throughout the case until the verdict came back. So it's unusual to see the prosecuting attorney on one side and the defense attorney on the other chatting about this case that they both handled. But there are some unusual developments this past week. David, why don't you tell us what those developments were?
They redid this case on 2020, and it's been many, many years, over a decade. And before that, Dateline did a couple hour special on it as well.
So we're talking about network TV, national TV. ABC
National
is
TV. 2020,
and I think Dateline is NBC, correct?
Yeah. And the trial was filmed, or at least it was projected in the courtroom, and that was at the height of Court TV. And they played the whole trial. And every year on New Year's Day was like their biggest trial. And they played that over about 3 times or 4 times every January 1st. Yes, there was a lot of people watching the television show, but they just replayed it over and over again. So new audience members didn't know what happened. So they liked that part about it.
Well, they actually covered it gavel to gavel.
Yeah.
And live. And in those days, it wasn't uncommon to have our trials covered gavel to gavel by even the local media. Sharee Miller was an interesting defendant, and this is an interesting case for a lot of reasons. Number one is everybody's interested in who did it and why. And it also has sex. It has jealousy as a motive. It has all the ingredients, manipulation, love. I don't know if love was in this. She did profess love in her confession letter. But it's an interesting case because it contains all these elements that Dave and I have seen over many years in homicide cases in Flint. And there was something weird about this case. And the weird part was, back then, David, a young lawyer who had quite a bit of experience at the time he tried this case, emails, we didn't use emails, we used the document. So we're taught in law school on how to make sure this document's authentic. And so we learned all the procedures about how to prove that something should be considered as truth by the jury, as that it has veracity. And this case presented a whole different wrinkle to it, which was email. Talk about that for a second, David, because that really set this trial off in a direction that I didn't want it to go.
Yeah. Well, we now know, and we were learning as the time and was progressing, that you could do an email, and someone would send something as much as like, "Hi, Dave, this is Art," and on my end, when you send that, I could change whatever you didn't want to say, or I could put anything in there. I could put a whole paragraph in, and it would be associated with you. And that was really dangerous for some people, because if they're out there playing around and poking around, or maybe adulterous situations going, people could really add and enhance to something and maybe get them to say maybe things that they didn't want to say, or really put somebody in a bundle, because they could basically blackmail them.
Correct. And besides making up their own story, at that time we had no concept of what cyberspace was, and the email process, to prove it's authentic, you have to show that person that touched those keys is the same person who sent that thing that went into your email box. You remember that? Showing that process in between sending it and when it was received, and when the police then forensically took a laptop and discovered the emails, you had to show this thing's bouncing and it bounces all over the world.
Right.
Was that difficult for you?
Well, I hired an expert who is a Michigan State young professor, and he went through and did the whole analysis of the software, because the law enforcement and your office obtained that, and that was vitally important in this case. But the same situation on my point is exactly what you said. Somebody can write anything in it. At that time, there were no safeguards. So I could just say hi, and you could put in anything you want from me. And when we're dealing with somebody who is like this, and they have this relationship and, back and forth, it was this torrid relationship. Sometimes it was great. Sometimes they were fighting, all sorts of things like that. You just wondered, was this real? Because she was acting like she was assaulted by a whole bunch of people that her husband made her do. It didn't seem realistic. And there was no evidence really of it, but you could take a picture and pretend, use makeup and show that you're all beat up by your husband, which occurred in this particular case. And it really didn't happen. And I was looking at this like, wow, this thing is so manipulatable.
It's almost as if she sat in the dark recesses of her home and constructed a narrative for this fabulous soap opera.
Yeah. Well, she met Jerry first. He had some problems. He used to be a police officer. He lost his job doing that. He was drinking a lot. No one's going to argue with that.
Okay. Jerry Cassady was his name.
Jerry Cassady. Yeah. And that's how they met out in Reno. She took a weekend with the girls, and her husband went down to watch some NASCAR in Vegas. And so she ended up meeting him, and it was a torrid affair, basically. And that's where it started. And the emails that were subsequently back and forth were just like, out of like a book, a Harlequin romance type of thing. Some of it was nice and some of it was dirty and some of it was filthy. And that was one of my concerns. We had, it was split. There was women and men on this, and some good, I saw some crosses on some of the women's come out of their sweater wearing their crucifix. And I thought, man, this is going to get, we got to be real careful about who we get put on this jury, because.
So you weren't looking
Yeah.
for the little old lady with blue hair from the First Baptist Church of Mount Morris.
No, but guess what? We went through all of our choices basically to pick a jury, and that's when you get down to the nitty gritty, you only have a few picks left, and you can't just kick somebody off because they're wearing a crucifix. So we had some home moms that did have those crucifix, and I had to talk to them about it. Here I am from Powers Catholic High School, and I got to walk a fine line to make sure that they don't get offended, because likely they're going to be on the jury, because we were down to just one pick. To pick off out of a crowd. That's how the process works. So it was walking on a minefield that we didn't know where the mines were.
Well, let me come back to the jury here in a second, but let's lay out the facts of this case a little more as we're talking. One of the things that I did want to say was, not only was it on television and these what we call news magazines, a Lifetime movie was made of this. It was a movie made from a best-selling book. So the script came from the book, I believe, and then it became a movie on television on the Lifetime channel. This case has just had, as you mentioned, the regular press. I'm talking TV, radio, newspaper, magazines have just been relentless in not wanting to give this case up to the great gods in the sky. What happened is essentially he committed suicide. And he lived in, as I recall, it was Kansas City. He left a handwritten note, and that note was essentially a suicide note, which laid out his relationship with Sharee Miller, as well as his involvement in this homicide of her husband, which occurred in Flint, Michigan, actually in Clio, Michigan. He had come to Michigan at her insistence, that he come to Michigan, and they discussed killing the husband. And there's a lot in between all that. The case was assigned to the Genesee County Sheriff's Department, was investigated there by a couple of detectives, Kevin Shanlin and Ives Petrovka, who later became an investigator for the Attorney General's office. And he was an expert in cybercrime or computer crime. And that really was how he got involved in this case. Tell us about your experience, David, with picking that jury.
What we did, I wanted to have people that were real and sort of had some involvement in the internet. Some people didn't, some people did, but that way they would have a concept that you can really live whatever you want to live, be whatever you want to be. And just because you're not being truthful doesn't mean you're a bad person. You're just enjoying the benefits of having this new creation. So you can be Superman to women, or they can be, beautiful Daisy May. And in reality, they're not, but they're just seeing pictures. And, but they like that there was this, the honeymoon of this thing was it started was a lot of people using it for sexual advances that never would happen. They never would meet up. It would just, and people would have multiple different people. Jerry Cassady had multiple different women that he was flirting with or talking dirty with. And, there's even some gay porn on his hard drive. So I'm not sure how that correlates to him or not, but it was on there. And so you can really be whoever you want it to. And if you had time on your hands, because most people have to work, but Sharee wasn't, she's dabbling with some work and taking care of her kids, but also Jerry was out of work and he living in his cousin's basement. And so he had lots of time, his hard drive showed he was working other women too. And that was a point I was trying to get at. If we're going to play this game, this sexual game, because believe me, we couldn't even say this on the internet, but it was really, really salacious stuff about what they wanted to do with each other here. I said, during a trial when I was doing closing, I said, this material would make a pimp blush because it was that bad. It was that bad.
Well, when you were picking the jury, you actually had a man who was actually a member of the media.
Yes.
Was sitting in that jury pool and
yes.
Ended up in the box.
Yes.
And tell us about him. You can
Well,
identify him by name. He's quite proud of his work.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Michael Thorpe, and he was just interviewed on that special they had in 2020. He's a charismatic guy. He was a newscaster, and then he was involved in the media for a long time, and Boy Scout leader. Just a really good guy. I thought, well, from his TV persona, and that goes to his real life, because I met him privately away from, the television. Just he was a very good guy, a very straightforward guy. And I knew that there was, that could be a problem, but it might not be a problem because I know he's fair. And we had exhausted a lot. And I was more concerned about some of these people that had deep religious tendencies, and they didn't seem like they really wanted to be there. I asked a few questions, but I left him on at the time. And he was very friendly. Judge Fullerton, who was our presiding judge, she knew him well from media, because these cases have media. And so she was smiling at him. Not smiling at me, but smiling at him. And so I knew that there might be the possibility of something, but the client approved leaving him on.
The attorney that tried the case on my side, which was Marcy Mann, came back and reported that he ended up on the jury, because our prior conversations was, if he's in that jury pool, we weren't too keen on him as a juror in the case, not because we didn't think he'd be particularly fair, but we thought that we knew him, and he had covered crime in Flint, so he was going to have some expertise that we were worried about, him dominating the jury. So I indicated to her I wasn't real crazy about that idea, keeping him on a jury. When he finally was selected, I really had my doubts, and it was only because when you put somebody like this on a jury, not that he couldn't be fair or impartial, but what he would become is he would dominate the jury, is what my fear was. So because of his special knowledge, because of his status in the community.
Yeah. He always seemed to me to be a very fair guy in my previous meetings with him, sort of right down the middle. Exactly what you said is exactly what I thought. Well, okay, there could be problems with that, and you don't want somebody who's so strong. And he's a religious man. And that can have a factor, because I knew what was coming. All right. I knew it was coming. You people knew it was coming. You saw the pictures. You saw the video. You saw the back and forth with, the information that, at that time, it was way out there. But now it's like everyday situations you'd see. But
he eventually got to be on the jury.
And he was a poor person.
And as I thought, and I think you probably did too, he would become the guy in charge of the jury, basically. Yeah.
He was the only male that was that we had this problem, because between he and the women on this, they all voted for guilt to some degree. And I don't know what degree it was at that time, because I think that the judge wanting to get this case over with, that they had been out for a long time, and we took this thing right up to Christmas Eve almost. We were Friday at 10 o'clock p.m., which is very unusual. They don't keep the courts open like that anymore. But at that time, the jury was out for several days, and people were crying and screaming and yelling. I walked in the office of the Judge Fullerton's office, and I'd see a couple lawyers and maybe some staff members. They can hear everything that's going on. That. We know that goes on, and they're not supposed to do that. But that everyone was so interested in what's going on. But there was yelling and screaming, and they come out, some people crying. So I thought, well, okay. I figured that the men would think this guy's full of, BS. He's just trying to get some, free ride from a gal that my client pretended she had lots of money. Her husband had lots of money, but they didn't. They were living a very, he had been married before and 2 other times. And so they just kind of crashed into each other and fell in love, and things were going great until this situation occurred. And I think that was just like a fantasy that got pushed too far. And then they were all in on it. It's like your chips in Reno. You push your chips in there and you're all in. And that's what I think really happened to these two, because it turned into something way different than a fantasy.
The plot basically has this sordid affair as its central focus, and Jerry Cassady becomes sort of the forlorn lover at some point, doesn't he?
He was dishonest with his own family too, because he was pretty broke, and he told his mother, could he borrow a flight to go see Sharee? Because he told the family all about her, and he didn't go into all the details about her being married and everything, but he made it sound like she was, Rolls Royce material driving, and that just wasn't the case. She's over in Mount Morris, working at the auto race place, and she's just had a little jobs at the time. She really liked that whole sort of game, if you want to call it that. She could dress up and look very professional, because she did do some Mary Kay cosmetics, and so anyway, that's that she came off like that. But he did say to his mom he needed $700 to fly to Flint because Sharee was having an abortion, and that was not true. And this is before that came out in the stuff going back and forth on the emails. So he had lied to his own mother, and we got into that trial. So that was important. I thought that was very important, because if he's going to lie to his mom for money, he's going to lie to anybody about getting money. I didn't think that he was going to be the one that would shoot him.
Now, she did. She was extremely manipulative, and she described her husband to this Jerry as somebody that was in the mafia.
Yeah.
And then she went on to describe him as somebody who beat her, and who also, once this affair started, she convinced that Jerry Cassady that she was carrying his children. You recall that?
Yes.
And I can't remember if it was twins or just one kid that she made up. I thought it was twins, which was pretty fantabulous.
Yes.
And then she takes a picture of herself and she says, well, I just pooched my belly out, or arched her back so her belly would look like she was actually pregnant. And sent Cassady in Kansas City a picture. And also she had bruises and all this, and she was, I don't know where she got those, but
Mary Kay cosmetics.
She
had her access to him, and that's
really?
she admitted that even on television here recently, that she used her makeup to make it look like bruises.
This sort of honeypot scenario that's playing out here, that if he somehow does her bidding, that there's this honeypot waiting over the rainbow for him, didn't quite materialize as he thought. The story, which I found shocking at the time, I still find it shocking, is that she had convinced Jerry Cassady that her husband had done all these things to her and actually caused her to lose the child that she was make-believe pregnant with. And in order to try and enrage Cassady, because he thought that was his child or children.
Yeah, it was getting a little too hokey the way I saw it too, because he's an ex-cop. He knows what's going on. And I think that a lot of it turned into fantasy stuff they were both doing, and they both agreed. I mean, they were both having these fantasy conversations, and that was just way over the top. And I think that, I don't think he bought that. Now, his mom, he's up there because she's having a baby, and that wasn't even a part of what anybody knew at the time. So he was lying to his mom just to get money to fly up there, and basically they hooked up for a weekend.
Well, eventually he gets convinced to come to Flint with a gun, right?
Well, that's how it's laid out. I wasn't there personally, but I had some questions because with this other suspect that I brought into the thing, he had a brother that said that he killed him, and he told him he killed him. I had that going for me, which was damaging on your end, but I think they went through that and successfully cross-examined those folks to take that out at the trial. But I was shocked because she was seeing this one fella, and that Bruce owed him some money, or it was vice versa. He owed Bruce money. So the argument was this guy killed Bruce because he didn't want to pay the debt. And so we put that in there too. So there were multiple facets, positive for the prosecutor, positive for the defense attorney, but they were all wrangled around the truth and what we thought the truth was, because both of these people had been lying back and forth at each other, but they also seemed very passionately connected. So it was like a scalpel. You had to take a really easy cut there, because otherwise you're going to cut yourself off as an attorney.
Yeah, so you've got a plot going on in a plot. Is you've got your alibi, somebody else did it, and you're deflecting. But at the same time, it seems pretty apparent to me and to the jury that Cassady did in fact come to Flint and did shoot the husband at his place of business in Clio. Cassady drove his car all this way.
Allegedly.
allegedly in a fit of rage. That was the story that the jury seemed to buy anyway. That's the basic fact as they're alleged. You disputed some of this, obviously. It sounds like your strategy was to describe it in different terms, such as this was really make-believe and fantasy that got out of control. Was there some other theory that you had?
Well, when it came down to, I've talked to some of the jurors. One guy who worked at the post office called me up and said I didn't feel comfortable, even though I said guilty and all that. And I was like, well, listen, I'm not going to get into that because, you never know if a juror's going to be called back or something if something comes up. The precipice of the conviction, I think, came when she demanded to take the stand. I've won a lot of cases, more than I've lost, and I haven't really lost many on the button. I didn't want her to take the stand, and I've won doing both of them. And when you're comfortable, I just think that the cross-examination showed some things, and they caught her in what they claimed was a lie. But there's a document that was written, and that was really, that was the real killer here in the case, because she couldn't explain it. That was a part of her image. She thought she knew it all. You should listen to your lawyer. There's two kinds of lawyers: those who listen and those who lose witnesses wide. And she wanted it. She wanted to get up there and testify and say I didn't do it, but that was a mistake. I didn't want her to, because I thought we had an acquittal if we just rested the case right then, because things were going our way with the computer technology. Everything that came at us we were able to push back on. But Marcy did a great job. I don't know if Peter helped out a little bit on that, but Marcy did a great job, and it was a wonderful cross-examination. Looking back on it, of course, but she got her caught up and twisted around, and there was a couple of letters she forgot about, exposed her, and that connected it. And I think that was really the most. I think if you ask the jurors, it was her taking the stand, because a couple of them told me that after the fact. They still fought about everything, but when it came right down to it, it was her testimony. It was a long testimony. She was not used to that. She could do all this with other people and make people believe her. But jurors are sitting there and they're not happy that they're there. Christmas is coming up. They're getting stuff read to them. The judge allowed a couple of people from the sheriff's department to actually portray them. And I had to jump up all the time and say, hey, they're accentuating it. Yeah, they're not just reading it like computers, And I said, I said, Judge, just let them read the stuff. We'll take half a day and let them read it. Because they don't have to look at evidence. They don't have to, the rules. They don't have to push it down their throat. But and the gal is older and she's wearing a sheriff beat up outfit, and the guy's young and he's handsome. He's a detective now there. But he was all dressed up in a nice suit, looking good. And I could just see the charisma oozing away from my case. And so with that going on there, I thought, well, I still can beat this thing easily. I thought, with just an argument. But she wanted to take it. She was convinced. And when your client says, I want to do it, you can't say no.
When people want to take the stand and they're accused of murder, it almost never works. Like, it's not very often that somebody gets on the stand and almost any kind of criminal case, takes the stand and actually tells something to the jury. You get some of these people like her, obviously she's fairly narcissistic and manipulative, who think they can convince anybody of anything.
Yeah. I've had clients that took the stand in these types, not this type of case, but basically when they're talking about what happened maybe on the street before they shot and killed somebody, they had the juries follow along and it's acquittals. However, there's so much information out there in writing, and that could be associated with her and him. And even though I could throw all these other women that he was dealing with, it wasn't to the extent that it was with this one. They were much more intimate with the conversations, and and these people are looking at it, and I could see some of those jurors with a crucifix on their sweater, just sitting up a little bit, perking up a little bit, and it was that is not the same as what we did in the street. There's paperwork and on and on, and so it was just a matter of, did she do it, did she not, and there was a lot of circumstances. Jerry blamed her in a letter, a suicide note, and I think that got to the jury. And at one time, I think the appellate court threw it out. I tried to get it thrown out too, but the judge didn't for the trial. One judge down in Wayne County, but it was a federal judge. I was there when she made the decision. She was released for several years.
Sharee Miller gets convicted by the jury.
Yes.
She gets acquitted of the biggest count.
Right. No possibility of parole. So she's at least got parole opportunity.
So she doesn't get a life sentence, a natural life sentence, but she does get convicted basically of a second-degree murder. So that carries any term of years up to in life. Early on in the case, we assessed the case and said, there's hills and there's valleys in this case. There's parts of this case that are going to be really on our side, probably would convict the jury, or convince the jury. And then, as you pointed out, the holes in the case, there were many. Based on that, prosecutors generally weigh the value of getting a sure conviction versus betting the farm on something and having somebody who's involved, to the extent we thought she was, in engineering a homicide. So we made her an offer of a 15-year. We communicated that to her lawyer, which was you.
That would be me, yes.
Yes. And somehow her family and her forgot that someplace along the line.
I can tell you this, was encouraged by the offer, because as you have done and I have done, you do trials, you get a feel for juries, and you can tell a lot of things, how they're acting in body, nonverbal communication and whatnot. And some people just flat out disgusted, shaking their heads, and some of that was going on there. So I thought that she should take the deal, because guess what? Had she taken that deal, she'd be out right now.
Probably so. And yes, she thought that this thing about making this stuff up about nobody told her that there was a plea offer was rather fantastical.
Yeah.
She had one member of her family going around the community trying to say that our office had been unreasonable, that I specifically was unreasonable in the handling of this case. Well, when I reminded those who inquired, I said, well, she had a path to walk, which was go to prison for some period of time or go to prison for all the time. I found it quite remarkable that she was going to say, the lawyer never told me what the deal was.
Yeah. Well, that was after we had lost communication, and I cut off communication. She had hired another lawyer for a lot of money and said that guy screwed her, and that the court appointed appellate lawyers who did a very good job in this matter, because they got her out of this thing at first. I wasn't the lawyer. I just went down there to support. And so she had her back up against the wall. And so she did this on her own, but she blamed all the lawyers except her.
Yeah, well, the jury convicts her on at least some of the evidence, if not all of it, that had been given by Cassady's family to the police, because Cassady left his computer sitting by his bed along with the note. And the computer was then examined by experts. That's how you got all this salacious material. And essentially it was a slow guilty plea on the chat logs, if you believe they were true and you believe they were accurate. That all creates this conundrum for judges who say, what's email? And I'm not used to this. And then it winds through the state system. And I think pretty much it was upheld. It was upheld.
Yes.
And then she wanders into the federal court system. At that point, in 2009, she gets another trial because we used the suicide note,
right,
and then releases her.
Yeah.
The crime wasn't like, she went shoplifting at Walmart yesterday. She poses a threat to a free society, as far as I'm concerned. So I'd never seen anything in 40 years of practicing law where somebody is releasing somebody who's charged with homicide. And I don't think the trial judge was happy either.
Of course she wasn't happy. We went through a lot of stuff together, all of us, and it was tough on everybody, tough on your office, and tough on the defendant's end, the family. And, those people were good people, good family members that are, just were, held aghast because of, what's going on there, and they have to sit there, but they're supporting their child who's an adult.
Obviously they are. The problem is that it wasn't like she was acquitted. She was let loose on a technicality pending another trial.
Yeah, I think the content was a bit of a problem. I mean, it was a big problem for me because I objected to it wholeheartedly. because it's not, he just, the only thing he said about her was, I went there and shot and killed him and didn't say anything else. There was a lot of room for him to say, this is what I did with the shotgun. I threw it in the Odessa River, or it's somewhere, back up what was written. And also he went into a long paragraph, talking about his son and I love you, and dad, messed up in life, not over this, but other failures. My position was, look, he's combining a lot of failures in his life that have nothing to do with his case. The jury shouldn't hear any of that. My point was with the judges, like, just put in where he said that he went there and she did it, and she did it for him. But putting in all that very sad stuff to his son and whatnot, about hunting, and it's our favorite hunting tree, and that was over the top. I thought that was not about the guilt or innocence of this thing, and it really played. I think when the federal judge looked at it, said the same thing that I thought, which is that shouldn't be in there, because it's inflammatory. He was making himself out to be a great guy when he wasn't. I mean, he really wasn't.
We would say it's more prejudicial than probative. In other words, it didn't go to the opinion. And my team argued that it was circumstantial evidence that buttresses the rest of the evidence that we have. That's really what the legal give and take was.
That was successful with the federal court of appeals. So they set that aside. So
Exactly. She ends up coming back for round 2. By then, the federal court, higher court, had ruled in another case, had essentially made her mission impossible, because the judge who initially found that this piece of evidence that was pretty damning, it was improper, only to find that higher court had made a ruling that said essentially that this kind of evidence was proper. So that kind of put an end to the case, is what more or less happened.
She had a case, and as you know, sometimes you get stuck with several different cases, and the case that was up there with her was a horrible, I mean, this was horrible for what was alleged, but a mother and a daughter were raped and killed by some nut job over on the west side of the state, but they were in a federal park. So it was a federal offense. And he took his appeal up, and unfortunately we were right alongside of that fact pattern, and they were making the decision based on his situation. And then because they made that decision, then that really wiped her out. It cleared the way for it to be to a loss at that point.
So the federal judge in Detroit reverses courses. She ends up 3 years later, after being set free for 3 years awaiting trial. She ends up returning to prison.
Well, that's that. It comes back, and she reinstates the conviction, and she can appeal it again. And I believe there were some appeals, but there came a point where she was doing her own work, because she went after court-appointed lawyers, she went after hired lawyers.
She takes on one who later becomes the Supreme Court Justice in Michigan. Bridget McCormick was her attorney.
Yes.
And of course, all of them told her, in their own words, was not to tell the truth, not to tell her story.
Well, I was doing work for nothing, and I met with Bridget, and she did a fantastic job. She's a fantastic person, and she is very smart.
So anyway, she gets out, and then she believes that confession is good for the soul. Is that right? Is that what happened?
Well, I think she was setting herself up to try and get that appeal for her sentence, or maybe be eligible for parole. You don't find too many people that are accused of a serious crime and they maintain they didn't do it, and they get parole at any time, unless there's some new evidence that comes in as breaking, or DNA evidence that we didn't know about. But this happened during the course of DNA. It was admissible and whatnot, but it wasn't really that part of this case. So, she filed a petition on her own without even a lawyer. And while I think that her mistake was saying that all the lawyers screwed her over, that was a big mistake, because everybody fought pretty hard for her when they were the lawyer at the time. And that was the start of this motion. And then it went into that, she should get out and blah, blah, blah. It's a form motion. And it tried to blame everybody else but herself. And that's the sort of the general scenario of what this case is about. She's blaming everybody else but herself. She realized, probably, or somebody told her, that if you confess your crime, then that you have a better chance with a parole board than if you don't confess and the overwhelming evidence and convictions against you in a heinous crime like this. So I thought that was plotted out that way a bit. I wasn't a part of her team for years. She wanted to take shots at me and everybody else.
In 2017, she confesses in a letter to Judge Fullerton and to prosecutor. She basically acknowledges her responsibility for this crime. In her words, it was her that was responsible for 2 men being dead or killed, as she said. And I found her statements to acknowledge her own criminal misconduct. We understand why people do this. I mean, there are a lot of reasons. But when they're after a case is pretty much dead, the only reason to do it is to say to the parole board, look how I've really been here sitting in jail for 20 years. And now I get it. I get it that I did something wrong and I screwed up. And I'm really sorry. And it's a terrible thing, but I've learned. That way you can get out and walk down the road.
Yeah, I thought that she made what a horrible mistake to sit there and spend the first couple paragraphs telling about how terrible the lawyers were across the board, and then she goes into this oh, woe is me, because she's making an excuse, but she's saying I did it at the same time. She'd have been better off just saying I feel terrible about this and I did it. I think that would have gone a lot further down the road. It's not going to work in front of Judge Fullerton, but it's going to down the road. She'd have a better opportunity to get parole because blowing away the lawyers, she's still making the excuse like why she got convicted. And I just don't think the parole board, I don't know who's on them, but I know that those people are usually not just giving away freedom in situations such as this and waiting years before she can confess too.
If confession's good for the soul, then confessing twice is better, because Sharee Miller went on national television, it would have been yesterday or the day before, and does it again in front of God and everyone else, small children. I'm perplexed by that. I understand what her game is. I understand why she's doing this. At least I think I do. But I don't understand this whole thing with the news media that wants to continuously re-victimize the people who suffered. The families of these men are being re-victimized by the person who perpetrated this crime. And there ought to be some consciousness on the part of the news media that they're not going to allow this to happen. And one of the reasons that law got passed to keep them out of the prisons, the news media cameras, came out of Flint in a case that I handled years ago, George Creer.
Oh, yeah.
And every time he wanted to make some kind of statement, because he was manipulative with self-serving statements, he'd call the news media and they'd run to come and see him. And then there'd be another story, and then the families were all upset. And the people who were victims who had been molested were, really upset. And it seems like there ought to be some humanity on the part of some of these news producers. I mean, enough is enough of this story. That's the way I look at it. How do you look at it?
Well, I think that they must not have known about the past, that she already confessed in writing about it 10 years ago or whatever, how many years back, 7, 10 years. The story was good to play out the way they thought it was going to play out. Like all of a sudden, this is not known to the rest of the country. It was just on the record in Genesee County Circuit Court. It didn't go any further than that really after that motion. I don't think they appealed it. Trashing every lawyer you ever had that fought for you was not a very good idea to start that letter out. She's making an excuse, and that's not what you do at that point. If you're going to open your soul up, and again, that was not going to work with Judge Fullerton. She saw, and she was involved in that case. She's a very smart person. She's retired now, but she knew what was going on exactly, and she was not going to allow that.
Let me say this about Judith Fullerton, by the way. The appeals against her were the least likely to succeed of any of the judges.
Civil and criminal both.
Correct.
Criminal both. She did her own research on top of research, and you couldn't run anything by her. She was not somebody who would think emotionally about things. She was very matter of fact and concise with the law, and I respected that because sometimes it was on my side, sometimes it was against me, and I knew you knew what you're up against. She doesn't play any games, and realistically, we need judges that are going to be strong and not be swayed by things that might not be supported.
Well, looking back at this saga, do you have any final thoughts about its impact on the community?
The case, as I said, when they played it 4 times on New Year's Day when people were going to be home, and there was a lot of people who were putting in things on the internet in there talking about this and that. She's guilty, and no, she's not, and that. It's one of these things where there's 2 sides. Even with our jury at one point, there were 2 sides. A side of men that said this doesn't meet the smell test, and then yet they came over eventually at the end, and they made the decision they made, which is now, since a confession was made, the right decision.
Well, Dave Nickola, thanks for joining me on Radio Free Flint. I've really enjoyed talking to you about this case again, and I wish you the best.
Thank you, Art.
Thanks for joining us.
Tastes
Goodbye.
like turpentine. Well, Flint River water tastes like turpentine. Oh, they lied about the water. Now people are sick and dying. Well, the water was brown, smelled like chlorine. Still, the city officials said the water was clean. People broke out in rashes, some were losing their hair. They complained to the mayor, but he just didn't care. He said, Flint River water, well, it's pure and fine.